Welcome to the Polygamer podcast, where gaming is for everyone. Join us as we expand the boundaries of the gaming community.
Hello and welcome to Polygamer podcast episode number 106 for Wednesday, October 14th, 2020. I'm your host, Ken Gagney. We all consume a lot of media, whether it is Netflix or video games or written books, comic books, but especially during this troubling and challenging year of 2020, media has taken on a new importance and a new role in our lives. I've noticed one person on Twitter who has been long examining the role of media even before the pandemic, and I'm very excited to chat with her today about her expert insight into the role it plays in our lives. Please join me in welcoming the writer for Screen Therapy, Courtney Garcia. Hello, Courtney.
Hi, Ken. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to chat with you. I've been following you on Twitter, reading your WordPress blog, watching your YouTube channel. You have so many different media in which you are sharing your insights and your expertise. Broadly speaking, the brand that you write under, Screen Therapy, what is the focus of Screen Therapy?
So for Screen Therapy, what I really want to focus on is identifying the ways in which our relationship with our favorite games, movies, TV shows, and other online media, how does our relationship with these things influence our sense of well-being? I've noticed for a long time that there's kind of this disproportionate amount of research into the negative effects of media. And so what I really like to focus on is getting the conversation kind of jump-started into what are the positive effects of interacting with our favorite games or with games and movies that challenge us emotionally, and how does it actually help improve our self-knowledge and emotional intelligence.
When I hear the word relationship, I often think of something reciprocal where two people are interacting with each other. Is that true for media as well? Is it a two-way relationship?
That's a very interesting question. I do think there is some of a two-way relationship because a game isn't complete until a player steps into the player's shoes, until the character's shoes. So I do think a game designer, a game writer does have to write while knowing what their audience is going to be expecting or wanting, but of course not always giving them everything they want. And a player will only take what they want away from a game or see what they want in a game. So it is kind of a two-way conversation, but maybe over the development and implementation of certain types of media or games or movies.
I like that. A lot of what you write about you describe as media psychology. And I'm familiar, of course, with those individual words, but I rarely see them put together. So what is media psychology?
So media psychology is the study of interactions or relationships that humans have with media and the media technology that we deal with every day. That mediates the information that we take in. The field focuses on human behavior and media in general. There are different uses for the field of media psychology. Sometimes, well, actually most of the time, it's used for analyzing our perception of maybe commercials and ads. What I like to look at is the intersection between media psychology and the psychology of well-being.
What is the psychology of well-being?
So, of course, I think this is as old as psychology. I think we all have always wanted to know what is the secret for establishing a sense of both short-term and long-term well-being. It really varies throughout the ages of what well-being constitutes, if it's happiness, eudaimonic well-being, there's a lot going on with the field, but I focus primarily on latest research that talks about what it means to feel more well-rounded and appreciative, grateful in life, and to have lower kind of rates of stress and any kind of anxiety or depression.
And that's something that you feel video games can help us achieve?
Yes, I actually do think that they can be very useful tools, not in a way that people might think. I don't think video games can cure or heal anxiety or depression or other kind of forms of non-well-being. I think we can use them as tools to learn about ourselves and to strengthen our emotional intelligence skills so that we can treat ourselves.
It's long been reported that reading fiction, novels, etc., can help us develop our empathy, our emotional intelligence, because it puts us in the roles of these other characters, allows us to observe experiences and scenarios that we ourselves might not encounter, so that when we do encounter them, we are more prepared for them. We have that vicarious experience. Do video games have that same capacity? Is it more or less than books?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, yes, more so. And that might sound a little sacrilegious. We tend to look at books and novels as these kind of pinnacles of meaningful entertainment and meaningful, substantial media. But that's really, I think, due in part for the fact that they've been around the longest. We have hundreds of years of history with books. But even back in the day when novels were new, especially fictional novels, you could actually find some old writings, like this one particular essay I enjoy that's called On Novel Reading by, and I'm going to say his name wrong, Vicessimus Knox, an 18th century English essayist that would talk about the fear of what are, these young people doing? Everywhere I look, there's a young person with their nose in a book. And, these books are just fictional stories and it's going to rot their brains but said in the way that somebody from the 18th century would say it. And I think that, yes, we want to respect books and where they came from. We've institutionalized the teaching of how to analyze books and what to take from them. But I think movies, which have a bit more, clout than they used to have, is probably the next step. But games, I think, is really the cutting edge because they can offer more, because we really are being put in the shoes of those characters. We have to make the decisions that they make, if it's a game with, decision-making mechanisms, or even if it's a linear narrative. There's something really interesting about what happens to the mind when you're put in the shoes, when you actually act it out, as opposed to reading a novel where you can kind of distance yourself from what's happening. And so, yes, that's in that way, I think games offer more.
Do you feel that the ability for players to insert themselves into video games has either grown or lessened over the decades? Because 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when video games were new, we had games like Pac-Man or Colossal Cave where the character was a blank slate. And now we have games like Firewatch and Old Man's Journey where we're playing a very specific character. Does that become a barrier for entry?
Very interesting. I actually think it kind of works in the opposite way. Yes, Pac-Man and other characters from the, early days, Mario, were a blank slate that I guess you could insert yourself and there wouldn't be any kind of pushback of, oh, well, Pac-Man's making a decision that I don't agree with. But in today's games, yes, and Firewatch or even other games like Last of Us, there can be a little bit of dissonance there where you don't quite feel like, well, I probably wouldn't do what this character is doing. I think the real nugget of what identification really boils down to isn't so much of how much you can put yourself as a whole being, as your entire identity into a game, though you can do that with RPGs. I think the real nugget of the use of identification is relating to some aspects of that character, of getting invested emotionally in their context, in their life, in their story, so that you can relate it to something you've been through. And it just kind of teases out these emotions in you, or these experiences, or this empathy and identification that you wouldn't have had on your own, or you can't have with Pac-Man. I think it would be a very different emotional experience for any player to play Pac-Man or Firewatch.
It's almost like the Stanislavski method of acting, where you, in order to experience certain emotions, you relate it to your own experience, how it has made you feel in the past. And I noticed that in your video about Old Man's Journey, where you say, not only are we experiencing the main character's quest for forgiveness, but we are also, maybe we've been wronged ourselves and we're learning to forgive the person in our life who plays the role that the old man does in this game.
Exactly. Specifically for Old Man's Journey, I love its use for kind of guiding us very gently, kind of lovingly into the journey of forgiving someone. Because in order to get him from the beginning to the end, where he reaches his redemption, his getting his kind of forgiveness and reuniting with his family, in order to get there, you have to lead him. Even if his character has done things that you, of course, don't agree with, he has a very kind of complex past. If you don't agree with it, or if he is kind of very similar to someone who has hurt you, you've already gotten emotionally invested. And I can't think of any other situation besides maybe if you're really paying attention to like a movie or a book, but even then you're not acting it out. In Old Man's Journey, you're acting out, leading him to redemption that maybe before playing you wouldn't have thought he deserved.
In your video about that game, and also earlier in this video, you described it as eudaimonic, and that's on the opposite end of a binary spectrum from hedonic, which you would categorize Animal Crossing as. I have some questions about that scale, but before that, for those who haven't seen your video yet, can you describe what those terms mean?
Oh, sure. So hedonic and eudaimonic, I like to kind of talk about them being on a spectrum in terms of how a piece of media can influence us emotionally. So hedonic is where it's all about pleasure seeking or the seeking of non-pain or non-discomfort. It's all about fulfilling our basic needs. So a hedonic game might be something that is gentle and sweet, that helps us rest and recover. It's all about just making sure we're getting rid of our negative feelings and adopting a new, more positive, uplifted mood. And then along the spectrum over to the other extreme is eudaimonic. And this is the one that tends to get most of the kind of love and adoration as being true art. Eudaimonic media is where it's all about making meaning. Meaning making is a term a lot of media psychologists use around this. It's all about emotionally complex narratives or decisions, something that really makes you think deeply about the nature of happiness, the nature of humanity. It's a very inspiring, it's a very kind of complex end of the spectrum. On that end, we might put things like What Remains of Edith Finch, or closer to there, maybe more towards the middle, maybe Gone Home, or more in the extreme, The Last of Us. These are games that have really made us think, oh, games can be art, as opposed to what's on the hedonic end of things. But I would argue that one isn't better than the other.
When might we want to seek a game on one end versus the other? I mean, a lot of people see video games as escapism, and there's nothing wrong with that. Would that be more on the hedonic scale, where we just, 2020 is a dumpster fire, we want to escape from it, so we're going to play something on that end of the scale?
Yes, exactly. And that's why we've seen the increase in attention for games like Animal Crossing, things that are soothing. I also wrote about the genre of Ioshike games that are all about healing a player. And that's really on the hedonic side. You've got it exactly right. When we're stressed, when life has us down, we want something that, yes, is kind of escapist, but helps us exercise parts of ourselves that we don't usually get help with, such as compassion or kindness for others and for ourselves. These things tend to kind of become estranged from us when we're so stressed and we have to think about all the practicalities. And that's why we might, in times like this, kind of stay away from things that are more emotionally complex. We're already doing a lot of heavy lifting in our own lives. We don't need any of that in our leisure time.
Would you say that eudaimonic games are more cathartic in some sense?
Yes, definitely. I think when people talk about catharsis, they're really talking about a game or a movie, anything that's eudaimonic that builds up that sense of both internal or external conflict that is very satisfying or reassuring once you get over the climax of it, once you get into the resolution of exploring, well, what did this make me feel? How does it relate to my own personal journey? Yes, I think that's a lot more for catharsis. So in that way, if you're looking for kind of that sense of closure, you might crave eudaimonic media when you're stressed because you want to master what you're feeling or similar emotions, or you just want to master something for that sense of, I can handle this. You can revisit your resilience, but that's a very, it's a tall order, and you might only want to do that when you have a lot of, when you've rested and recovered enough.
Do all games fall somewhere on this spectrum?
I think all games, all movies, all books fall somewhere on the spectrum. And towards the middle are pieces of media that are both eudaimonic and hedonic, things that are both kind of silly and fun and sweet, but every so often touch on more kind of deep and philosophical or emotional tones as well.
Because all the games you've mentioned on the scale so far, Animal Crossing, Gone Home, Old Man's Journey, they're all relatively peaceful, non-violent games, which doesn't describe every game out there, of course. Mortal Kombat, Call of Duty, Red Dead Redemption. So do those games, does the presence of violence indicate where it might fall on the scale?
That's a wonderful question. And we're talking about more traditional games. I tend to focus a lot of my writing on indie games, but I really do think that for traditional games that put a gun in your hand and give you a lot of external conflict to deal with, they actually can lie mostly anywhere on the spectrum. I would argue Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2 lie more towards eudaimonic because you do have to tackle a lot of human relationships between your own playable character and others. You have to make those decisions. It's a lot more complex. Something like Doom or Mortal Kombat, those aren't meant to tease out any emotions from us other than mastery and control and relief. Those would lean more towards hedonic. And so I don't think violence necessarily has an impact of, oh, it's always hedonic or, oh, it's always eudaimonic. Because the violence in Last of Us 2 feels a lot more eudaimonic than the violence in Doom. And they're on very opposite ends of the spectrum. I think violence as a tool is really just a story writing tool. And it depends on how the writers use it or have the players use it in the game for what it takes out of us or brings out of us in the end result.
Since we were talking in the framework of whether or not games can develop our emotional intelligence, or not whether or not they can, but how they can, does that apply to all games on the spectrum as well? Can Mortal Kombat develop our emotional intelligence? Because that's a game, ever since the Columbine shootings and the Senate hearings have long been associated with the moral panic of youth violence and behavior. So what emotional intelligence can be developed from games like this?
That's a very interesting question. And I think, honestly, no, not all games can help us develop our emotional intelligence, but I think almost all games can give us something that we need. And sometimes that isn't to exercise or to challenge or to grow our emotional intelligence. Sometimes it is we just need to rest and recover and escape and distance ourselves from our real life stressors, bring down our sympathetic system so that we can relax and actually feel strong enough when we go back into our real life and our real responsibilities. But this is very kind of similar to the question of if we were to look at books or movies, can Pulp Fiction or reality TV help us develop emotional intelligence? And really, it depends on the person. These are very much loved genres and games and very popular, but it really depends on the person. Your relationship with media, it really comes down to the individual. But in general, I think most of the time, these kinds of media just help us establish that kind of escapism, that kind of distance from stressors, which can also be very important. If we were to look at mood management theory, it's something that we're always doing. We're always trying to manage our mood and bring us down to something that's more calm if we're already in a heightened state, or if we're in a calm state, we might seek a heightened state. So it's really individual, but yes, not everything is going to help us develop our emotional identities. Sometimes it can just be fun.
Well, good, because I know that sometimes I want to engage with a piece of media that is going to make me think critically, and other times I need to turn my brain off, and video games can be good for either one.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
So since we were talking about violence in Mortal Kombat, I want to ask about media panic, because I wrote my senior thesis on moral panics, which is when there's a new form of entertainment that a new generation is enjoying, and the older generation is suspicious of it and associates it, wrongly or not, with delinquent behavior. So in the 50s and 60s, there was comic books and rock and roll. In the 70s and 80s, there was Dungeons and Dragons. In the 90s, and kind of ever since, there's been video games. So that's a moral panic, but you've had videos on your channel about a media panic. What is a media panic, and how does that relate to what I'm describing?
It's actually kind of one and the same. Media panic is more of a very precise sub-vocabulary term for a moral panic. Moral panic is something that can cover a lot. It can be different movements in history, different, movements of thought that can cause what you were talking about, this panic of, wait, what's happening to our culture, our society, our young people are being corrupted. Media panic is just a term I've seen in, scholarly articles, and that I use myself to just narrow it down to the panic that always seems to envelope every new type of media. I mean, back in the day, right, as I was talking about, books used to be a source of panic of what are they going to do to our youth? Movies have done the same. TV have done the same. Now it's games, the turn for games to have. And even way before all this, I've argued that, people in ancient history were also very skeptical of the medium of writing, of what that was going to do to the mind.
Right, because if you write anything down, then you won't have to remember it anymore.
Exactly.
You wrote on your blog about how in the past few years we've seen more studies about the positive effects of video games, and that's also been true during the pandemic. Is that to say that studies showing the negative impacts of video games are not true, or just that they are an incomplete picture?
I really like how you phrase that. I do think they're a very incomplete picture. And yes, there has been a lot more positive research that's gone into games as this field is growing. Media psychology in general is still a very young field if you compare it to other psychology fields. And I think the pandemic we've seen a lot more positive talk about, oh, Animal Crossing has really helped me, or this game has really helped me, or, while in their stories, while they're trying to find some normalcy or recover, and it's helped them just get day to day and building that kind of routine time of rest. And I think that really what it comes down to with research is just what the culture is saying. I think because our cultural knee-jerk reaction is a media panic for the past 30 years or so, we've seen a lot of research into the negative effects of video games. But I think it has been pretty much kind of used up. It's just kind of been kind of on a wheel of going, kind of repeating itself, this kind of research. And it is widely funded because these are very hot button topics. People will want to pay for and read articles that confirm biases against games, such as how do games make us aggressive? How do they make us violent? But I think it is a very incomplete picture. Of course, games aren't only positive. I think, as with anything in life, there are negative effects. There is sometimes a risk for overuse. There is a risk for desensitization. And research has shown us some of these risks. But again, that's actually another reason why I'm so passionate about writing about these things, because if we buy into the cultural narrative that games and other forms of media are just rotting our brains, that they're just bad, they're just fast food for our brains, we'll never understand how to use them in a more positive way, or the techniques of how to avoid the pitfalls of overuse or desensitization. So we have to educate ourselves in how to use this new medium for the better of ourselves and the public, so that we can take it in the direction that it'll need to evolve in to do more good.
And video games have evolved a lot in the last 40 years or so. For example, you have written or done videos about some games that I've really enjoyed, like Gorogoa, Florence, Old Man's Journey. Those kinds of games didn't really exist 30 years ago. And also, I don't think I would have enjoyed those kinds of games 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I was playing Wolfenstein 3D, Final Fantasy IV, almost anything that came my way, I would get my hands on, I would enjoy it. But there weren't those kinds of introspective, narrative-based games back then. So I'm thinking not only has the medium evolved, but so have the players. And I'm wondering, do games like these require a certain amount of emotional development or emotional vocabulary to appreciate, or can anybody just pick these up and play them?
I think it's a little bit of both. Games are made generally for anybody to be able to pick up and play them. However, it is an interesting question of, do we need some kind of prerequisite knowledge or emotional development in order to really appreciate these games? And I actually love the idea of players being equipped with vocabulary before they go into their journeys, so that they can have some help finding meaning in non-traditional games. And that's a large part of what I'm trying to do with my writing. But I don't think it's necessary. I think a lot of times going into a game, even something that's really introspective, like Gorogoa, Florence, Old Man's Journey, I think as long as you have the kind of emotional context within yourself to empathize and sympathize with these characters, you can take a lot from it. Whether or not somebody will enjoy these games is another question, because whether you've seen these kinds of games before in the past or you're willing to give them a shot really depends on a person-by-person basis and how much they've gotten into other genres. It's kind of the same thing with movies. Somebody who only watches dramas might be skeptical of, well, what can a rom-com do for me? Is that really going to give me anything that is substantial? And they might be surprised, and vice versa. So I think this is actually really interesting because we're kind of on the precipice of hopefully developing that kind of vocabulary or understanding of how to interact with games that we already established with books. Because like I was saying before, we've institutionalized the analysis of books and novels. We went from the media panic around them to now most kids around the world will learn in some way how to analyze a story and the hero's journey or phases of a story, from exposition, rising action, climax, resolution. We all know the words kind of theme or motif, or we all know the phrase moral of a story. It's been written into kind of general knowledge how to analyze, at least in some way on our own, a book and maybe even a movie, because we see a lot of movie critics who have popularized these phrases and taught us so much. But we haven't seen that so much with games. Usually for game reviews, we might focus on mechanics or how it just feels to play the game in terms of, did it feel fun, or was it, too long, too boring, or was it emotionally this or that? But there's not a lot of talk into maybe the terms we could be using far into the future, such as identification, hedonic, eudaimonic, resilience, ludonarrative dissonance, or antecedent-focused regulation. Maybe not that one because it's a mouthful, but equivalents of, right, of how to interact with interactive narratives. We're still learning. This is still such a new and young media that it's actually really exciting to look into. But I also want to talk about, you said, do we need some emotional development before we can recognize the use or the usefulness, the helpfulness, or just or unlock the enjoyment of games like Gorogoa or Florence or Old Man's Journey? And I think there is something to that. But emotional development isn't linear. I mean, I think we've all experienced as kids, maybe we were told to read a book that we really didn't get, and maybe we thought it was boring or long, if that's Moby Dick or To Kill a Mockingbird or something like that. I think we've all had those experiences where we watched something or read something a little bit too early. And although we knew everybody was telling us, oh, this is really important, we just weren't really there. It didn't really have a spark for us. But if we were to revisit these stories later on in life, we've gotten that emotional context of, oh, this is why this is important. We can finally feel what people were feeling. So maybe, yes, there is something to that, but it's not linear and it's not the same for everyone. Somebody could still return to Moby Dick after 30 years and just not quite feel, what's trying to be translated. And that's okay, because not everything is meant for everyone. I think art is put out there as tools for those who need it.
It's interesting about having the background to appreciate these. For example, I played Florence, and I'm somebody who's been in a variety of relationships of different types in the last 10, 20 years, and I really empathized with this game. I really enjoyed it. And then I showed it to a friend of mine who hasn't dated in 30 years, and he found it very boring. And yet, conversely, Zoe Quinn's Depression Quest, I've never myself personally experienced depression or bipolar disorder, and yet playing that game was groundbreaking for me because it was the first time I really felt like I could understand in some level what other people were experiencing, and it helped me develop my empathy. So that's a case where not having the background was what made the game revolutionary for me.
Very interesting. I really like that. I think that simulation games have a lot to offer. If it simulated the if it simulated the feelings and kind of the day-to-day life of what it's like for somebody with depression, I feel like those are very useful for developing empathy, for communicating ideas that you can't really read and incorporate very well. Maybe if you read a 200, 300-page novel, you could incorporate the same amount of meaning you can get from a game, but that's just my opinion. I think that simulation games have a lot to teach us about how to learn about others and empathy. And narrative games like Florence can help us learn if we have something to kind of bring to the table already. But again, I think our relationship with different media is very individual, because sometimes people can close off their minds to a certain game because it takes an angle they don't appreciate, it uses a mechanic they don't feel like they can naturally do well in. It really comes down to the very minute details of associations every single person has that are unique, that might close them off or invite them into different experiences.
You mentioned how video games to date are not critiqued at the same level as books and movies. And I wonder if some of that is due to the audience, the gamers themselves. I don't follow movies and books as closely as I follow games, so I may be speaking out of turn here, but I get the sense that people are not as passionately defensive about books and movies as they are about games. And when we try to critique some games as art, there is sometimes some pushback that I don't see in other media.
Definitely. And I think you're very right about that. There is a lot of passion for games because I think we've all been told, oh, that's just a game. Or, oh, you're still playing video games? I thought you liked them when, I liked them too when I was in high school, but I got over it. I grew out of it. Because we're always kind of constantly battling that very low rumbling in the background of our culture's media panic around games, that they're toys, mindless distraction, disposable, kind of meaningless distraction, or that the people who play them can't go out and live lives of their own. I mean, really similar to how books started out, people thought, well, if you have to have someone tell you something new, then you must not be thinking a lot of new thoughts for yourself, or people who, with their own opinions, don't need to read the opinions of others. I think it's the cultural context we have. And so it's not so much that critique is failing in any way, that the critique of games is failing in any way. I think this is really just about being in the infancy of identifying a new form of art. I think we're still, if we were to time travel into the future and look back, the 2020s will probably still be a time when maybe we're at the end of the conversation of can games be art? We still do get pushback. I like to pretend when I'm writing that we're in 2050 and it's been well established that games are art and that they, like art, have something to offer us. So I like to pretend that there's an audience out there for what I'm writing, people who will just accept point blank games are art. But I think, yes, there is still a lot of work, culturally speaking, for everybody to get on the same page. I'm just a little impatient.
So am I, and I hope we don't have to wait until 2050 to get there.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of games that you and I both enjoy and appreciate. Gorogoa, Florence, Old Man's Journey. But there are some other games you've played that just went right over my head. Like Undertale, kind of like you, I waited years to play it, avoided all the spoilers. Also Night in the Woods, which I backed the Kickstarter for. Finally played both of them in the past year, and they just fell flat for me. I mean, I enjoy story-based games. Nowadays, if a game does not have a story, I'm very unlikely to be hooked by it. And these two games have stories, but I couldn't get into them. So what am I missing with these games?
I love this question because it's really an opportunity to kind of let people know that it's okay to not like everything. I mean, I think it's very natural that we all want to feel like, well, this is such a well-loved game. Everybody says such great things about it. Am I missing something? I think it's actually very normal and common that not everyone will love everything that everyone else loves. And there's important reasons for that. I like to look at games and all forms of media as something that might provide me something I need. It's just a matter of enjoying a piece of media and in the back of my mind trying to identify what I can learn from it. But there have been times where I know cognitively, okay, this has useful lessons. This is helping me practice identification. It's helping me practice empathy. But emotionally, it doesn't spark what I know it's trying to spark because I just happen on a personal level to not need it. I don't need that right then. I needed something else. But for the most part, as stories progress, we don't know what it's about to tell us. I don't know what Undertale is going to tell me. And there is no way that I could have predicted the ending of Night in the Woods. And, I actually experienced a little of that with Night in the Woods. I really like the game. It's wonderful. I really enjoy it. It's very intense towards the end. And there's a lot that it kind of covers and looks into that I think is very admirable. But in a way, just on a personal level, I could feel its message kind of slip past me a little bit, but I can see how it's so important for others. But I'm not very concerned with, it didn't give me like the emotional revelation that I was, I thought I had to have. But yes, so sometimes we still won't need what some art tries to give us, and that's okay. we get confused sometimes thinking that all art is supposed to be made for everyone. But sometimes if you don't have that spark with the piece, it's okay to move on to something else that has that spark you need instead of trying to fit everything into yourself.
So it doesn't mean that I'm emotionally dead inside?
No, no, it just means that you need something else. And just like anyone, that's, perfectly okay.
So since I've identified which games I did like and which games I wasn't able to appreciate as much as I would have, are there other games that you would recommend that I check out?
Oh, I think it's a wonderful question, but I am so overwhelmed by the list that flashes through my brain, and then I forget everything when somebody asks, like, oh, what game should I play? Oh, Journey. But I mean, have you played Journey?
I have played Journey, thankfully.
I think a lot of people have already played Journey. I have a list on both my blog and on my YouTube channel, at least of what I've made so far that I think could be useful for anyone. But I think what's actually important is that to identify that recommendations don't always fit. What I think you need to play might not be what you need to play. It might be something, well, that was nice, but that's not exactly what I need. It's, again, very individual. But I would really look at games that we don't want to give a chance. That's what I always try to kind of look at, games that are breaking the rules a little bit of what a game can be. I think those are the ones that are most worth a play, and especially ones that are made by indie developers that are on the cutting edge of what is this experience that I'm about to embark in. I've never been on something like it before. One that just flashed in my brain is something that is a game that I've loved for many years, and I had no idea what I was walking into. It was The Beginner's Guide. Have you played The Beginner's Guide?
I haven't played The Beginner's Guide or The Stanley Parable.
Oh, okay. Well, I highly, highly recommend them if you're in the mood for some existentialism, if you're in the mood for Stanley Parable is a little bit more hedonic. It can be a little bit more enjoyed, with a sense of humor. The Beginner's Guide is something that if you're looking for a 2-hour experience of analyzing others, analyzing yourself, and emotional revelations that kind of might disturb a little bit, that's what I would suggest if you're looking for some emotional challenge to sharpen some emotional intelligence skills.
I have wanted to play those games, but last time I checked, which admittedly was a while ago, they were Steam games, not console games, and I have not been much of a Steam gamer. In fact, nowadays, where I'm on the road a lot, my primary console is the Switch. I'm not traveling with my PS4, so it limits my access to some of these more engaging games, unfortunately.
That's very true. And I'm really hoping for a future where we can have so many engaging and eudaimonic games to pick from on all platforms that we're kind of covered. But a lot of the games that I think are the most kind of engaging or eudaimonic tend to be PC games, unfortunately.
And you mentioned that they also tend to be indie games, but you had also talked about how The Last of Us 2 is emotionally challenging. And I want to talk a little bit about that term, because when we boot up a game, what I often do is I go right into the options first to make sure like the sound, the controls are the way I want. And one of those options is the difficulty setting. It can be easy, normal, hard, expert. And that's usually referring to the gameplay, not to the content or the story. And yet, nonetheless, that challenge is still there. The games can be emotionally difficult. When we talk about a game being emotionally difficult, does that necessarily make it hard to play like gameplay difficulty does?
I think absolutely, because there are plenty of games out there that the gameplay is easy. It's the gameplay in your mind or in your heart, but let's just say mind, that is a lot more difficult. I think that, yes, if something's emotionally challenging, it can definitely be hard to play or finish. I think we've all rage quit something because it was too difficult technically. Maybe the mechanics were difficult to master. I think of Bennett Foddy's Getting Over It. You reach the top of the mountain and then you make a slip and then you fall and you're back at the bottom. It takes a lot of emotional resilience to pick yourself back up and try to get to that top of the mountain again. But for something like The Last of Us 2, which I keep mentioning because I actually just finished it. Well, I say that. I finished it a week and a half ago, but it's still so fresh in my mind because of how challenging it was. There were plenty of times where I was just like, okay, I can't handle it. I've had enough. I need to take a break. I need to decompress. I need to play some Animal Crossing, kind of mood management right there. I need to manage my mood and take myself back to a more pleasant place. And there were plenty of times where I felt like I just kind of need to get out of here. This game is really brutal And I think, it really did make it more difficult, and in fact, almost too difficult, too challenging. And I think there is I love emotionally challenging games, though I don't play them that often for obvious reasons, because, I have other stresses in my life and I'm not always looking for that. I always want to play an emotionally challenging game when I feel like, okay, I'm ready to learn something. I'm ready to grow in a little way, a little bit, to identify with characters that aren't like me and to kind of help them reach their end and, see what I can learn from it. But there is kind of a threshold where you do have to look out for yourself. If the game is returning less and less for you in terms of what you can use for yourself and in your real life, or it's returning less for you where you end up feeling more stressed after the game than when you started it, I think it is prudent to take a breather, take a break, maybe revisit it later, because the emotional challenge of some games can be very, very taxing. And that's something that I think needs more recognition.
You didn't use emotionally challenging to describe Florence or Old Man's Journey, and yet those games do put you in the role of somebody else and help them along their journey. So I assume that they were emotionally challenging just at a much lower level than The Last of Us 2.
I like that comparison. I do think perhaps a lower level, but I don't like to tend to think of things as in low or high. So I'd say that they were challenging, but in Old Man's Journey and in Florence, we're really swathed in these beautiful colors and soundtrack. Everything is gentle and kind. So whatever challenge you go through, you're always being gently handled, kind of reminding you it's okay. This is human. This is a human story, and everybody's just trying their best. Last of Us 2 is, if anybody, I don't want to spoil it, of course, but if anybody's played it, it does not have any kind of, it has beautiful surroundings, but they're kind of disjointed from the actual gameplay, both emotionally, the emotional gameplay and the mechanics of the gameplay, other than hiding in tall grass. Maybe that's the closest thing you get for combining the beautiful aspect of the game with the challenging aspect of the game. In the other more, in Florence and Old Man's Journey, the challenging aspects are all beautiful in their own way. They give you time to rest and breathe. It feels like the writers for The Last of Us were more interested in just pushing you to your limit so that you can learn from that as well, because it really did feel like they were trying to teach us something, which is actually a pretty interesting kind of concept, that a AAA game actively trying to teach us emotional skills that maybe not necessarily everyone was prepared for going in. But when you go into a game like Florence or Old Man's Journey, I think players are prepared that they're going to be feeling something, and that and when they're handled so gently, it does make a difference.
It is nice, as you say, to see this level of emotional challenge in a AAA game, since it's so often the purview of indie games. Are there other AAA or mainstream games that you feel strive for that as well?
Wow. I would have to play more AAA games to really answer this question like an expert. But I think games that have massive, wide releases like Animal Crossing, I think Animal Crossing does serve a purpose. The developers of the original games have always said that, they were trying to make a communication game, a game that was all about connecting people and helping people just kind of relax and play with self-expression, those types of things. But that's so obvious, and that's something that we're used to. We're used to emotionally healing hedonic games, something that's made to be cute for the benefits of cuteness. But as for the benefits of learning from a AAA game that deals with eudaimonic aspects, I think that's still pretty rare. I have heard of other games, it's difficult to remember all their names right now, but other games that are trying to teach something or trying to teach perspectives. But I think The Last of Us 2 is actually pretty unique because it was only trying to teach, it was kind of, the Count of Monte Cristo. It was only trying to teach a moral. It wasn't trying to teach, I think, anything more substantial or applicable in terms of, it's difficult to say without spoiling it. I think it was teaching a perspective, and it wasn't so much teaching a more applicable, real life kind of political opinion. But again, that's my interpretation of the game. Everything, as I've been saying this whole time, everything's very individual. I'm sure there's plenty of people who might see it differently.
I too tend to play a lot of indie games, and I find that it sometimes limits our audience and our conversations by focusing on those. For example, I used to work at a hospital, and I was talking to a phlebotomist, and it turned out that we both love video games. And I asked him, "Oh, what do you like to play?" And he said, "Oh, Madden, Call of Duty, Mortal Kombat, What about you?" And I was going to say, like, Firewatch and Depression Quest. And that's not going to establish a common language in which we can have a conversation, because nobody's heard of these games. And by nobody, I mean mainstream gamers who are playing the games that they see advertised on TV or which they're picking up at GameStop probably are not going to be as familiar with Firewatch and Depression Quest as they are with Call of Duty and Red Dead Redemption. So I really admire that you're using your channel and your blog to get the word out about these. Is there anything else we can do to encourage people to play games that are more narrative driven or more emotionally challenging? Not that they need to or that they are inherently better, but that I think having diverse gaming experiences is beneficial for those who may not appreciate or realize what this medium is capable of.
That is such a good question. And I would say that as for us, or at least myself in my writing, all I can do is what I have been doing, which is I'm just trying to get the vocabulary out there. I'm trying to normalize the analysis of games as what they can do for us emotionally and psychologically to benefit us and to stay aware of any negative effects. That's all I can do. I think a lot of times these trends of what we expect from games, because it's really about what we expect from games. A lot of gamers might not play Firewatch or Depression Quest or Goa or Florence or Old Man's Journey because they're not expecting those things from games. So they think of a game they're used to, Call of Duty, Mortal Kombat, Doom, or, things like that. And so that's what they kind of go for. I think the change has to happen within the cycle of feedback, people like us that are putting more out there, and then developers who have an interest, like the indie developers, who then maybe can break into mainstream or influence mainstream game development that then can make things that are a bit more emotionally challenging. Last of Us 2, BioShock, Red Dead Redemption as well, I would argue, has its own emotional impact as well. Things that really do hit players. So people who came into like the first Last of Us, those players were expecting a zombie game, wow, this is going to be interesting, shoot some zombies, survival tactics, all that. And what they ended up getting was one of the most popular games of the decade because of the emotional journey it took them on. We hear about The Last of Us and we deal with The Last of Us in ways that we don't talk about other zombie games, Dead Island or I'm sure there's a whole long list of zombie games out there that we don't talk about as with such reverence because it didn't give us what The Last of Us did. And so again, I think it's really kind of a cycle. As we add to the conversation, more people will pick up on it, and hopefully it works its way up into mainstream developing, and then it can be sewn into the already in place expectations. We're not going to have a wide stream release of a game that is marketed as an emotional game. We're going to have games that need to be a quilt or, a mesh, a fusion of helpful emotional narrative and, fun, kind of traditional, expected gameplay mechanics with the beautiful graphics. It needs to be a marriage of all these things. And I think it's a very natural evolution. It will happen on its own, the way it happened for movies and the way it happened for books and for TV and everything else. We just have to kind of wait and keep adding to the conversation.
Well, I think the idea you've given me is to use AAA games almost to bait and switch people. Like I can say, hey, if you like Dead Rising, then you should try The Last of Us. It's a zombie game. And then they're going to play it and they'll be like, oh, this is a narrative-driven, emotionally challenging game. And then I can say, yeah, and if you like emotionally challenging games, try Firewatch. I think it's much easier for me to say, if you like The Last of Us, try Firewatch, than it is for me to say, if you like Mortal Kombat, try Firewatch.
That is a very interesting point. I don't know about, I don't want to trick people into, oh, play this. It's just fun zombie shooting. Oh, wait. Oh, you felt something. Oh, I didn't know that was going to happen. No, I don't want to do that because, right. I mean, some people went into Last of Us 2 expecting, oh, okay, it's going to be like Last of Us 1. And they were I don't want to say trick, but they might have felt similarly like, oh, I didn't sign up for all of this. So, I mean, there is something to it where it's like you can't trick people into it, but you can very subtly weave it into the gameplay so that the gameplay, the feel of the gameplay of what you do in the game speaks to what you feel in the game in a natural way that is rewarding, both hedonically and eudaimonically, kind of a good mixture. And I always love it if I see a game that does balance those things. It's just very difficult, and it just takes a long time because, right, people want to make games that people want to play, and people want to play what they've played before, in a way like just maybe a little bit spiced up. Trying new things always takes some time, and that's just normal.
Although, in my defense, I would say that tricking people is not necessarily a bad thing. For example, the Lego movie. I went into that expecting a kid's movie with a lot of bright colors and a lot of silly action, and it had all those things. But then there's this one scene at the end that's only like 2 or 3 minutes long, and it reframes the entire movie in a way that I found so powerful. And just that one moment elevated the movie for me from a good kids movie to a great film for all audiences. And I was not expecting that, and it came out of nowhere for me. If I can get somebody to play a video game and be surprised in a way that they reacted to it in a positive way, I'm willing to do that.
I think that's also good. It might really work out. I mean, there's no harm in just recommending things. And yeah, I love it when media can do that. I haven't seen Lego Movie, but I really do love it when it's able to, like you say, elevate or make itself more substantial, complex, or useful than it was before because it took a chance. It did something new with itself. And I think we're really starting to see everything I've been talking about. We're starting to see that with like Pixar movies and animated movies where they're going into places where we're not used to kids movies going into, but we're happy it's going there. Like Inside Out or other like more complex emotional movies like that. And I'm really hoping similarly, we can start to see that genre redefining action in games.
You mentioned that you're sharing your take on these games and promoting the medium both via your blog and your YouTube channel. Do you have a preferred medium, or how do you use them differently from each other?
For the blog, unfortunately, I haven't updated it in quite some time. And I think that's because I have migrated over to YouTube because, with my background and stuff, I recognize that my audience, like myself, might be visual, kind of auditory, kind of viewers and audience that appreciate something that's visual and auditory. So I do most of what I do on YouTube. It's more work, but I think it's a lot more accessible. And so my YouTube channel is where most of my new ideas are. But I have been, I might kind of go back to the blog. Other than that, I just have some thoughts that I kind of put on Twitter sometimes, and that's it.
And remind our listeners where they can find you on YouTube, Twitter, and your blog.
Okay, yeah. You can find me on YouTube. My channel name is Screen Therapy. And you can find me on Twitter, Screen Therapy. It's all, and my blog is a WordPress, Screen Therapy. It's all under Screen Therapy. If you Google it, it should be, if you Google Screen Therapy, it should be right there towards the top because nobody else is using that name right now.
So normally I would wrap up there, but I have one more question for you, which is your channel is called Screen Therapy, and the topic of your channel is media psychology. You clearly have done your work to study this topic, analyze it, critique it, engage with it, and you're not just speaking from your own experience or from your own opinions, but from actual research into this area. I would expect your background to be either therapy, media, or psychology. But in fact, your undergraduate degree was in history and your master's degree was in education. So how do you translate your experience and your education so well into these other topics?
Well, I actually think that my background has informed my interests and informed my own research in a lot of unique ways. While I was earning my master's in education, I focused primarily on socio-emotional learning and mental health education. So this introduced me to deeper understandings and ways to apply like Bandera's social cognitive theory, self-efficacy, emotional resilience theories, emotional intelligence theories, all these things that have a place in both education and in media psychology. And so that kind of that part of me that's an educator is always looking to find what is the nugget of truth, what is the center of each piece of art or lesson that I'm looking at, that is what we can take into our real lives and apply in order to better our lives. Most importantly, this type of thinking, the socio-emotional learning type of thinking, has influenced my writing a lot. You might notice in my writing, I try not to write simply like opinion pieces. I try to write kind of instructions on how to identify useful tools in games and in movies and in shows, how to identify tools within them for learning emotional intelligence skills. It's all about learning. That's what I'm really interested in, and teaching others how to use this vocabulary, how to see media in a new way, so that they can take it with them and kind of teach themselves more and more. Because if you learn how to see media through the lens of media psychology and well-being, you can take it into your life for the rest of your life. That's the one thing, is that we're only in school for, the first 18 years of our life, sometimes maybe more. And they don't really teach us how to interact with the things we're interacting with every day for hours every day, like movies and games and social media. And so if we can learn, even from a blog or a YouTube channel online somewhere, how to interact with the things that we interact with every day in a way that benefits us emotionally and psychologically, that's my goal. And I guess that's the education part of me. But I think something else about my history background is the fact that with my roots in history, it relates really well because of this. History is the study of relationships and stories and how to learn from them. And what is media other than a collection of stories, and media psychology other than learning how to relate to those stories, learning how our behaviors define our interactions with those stories. And so I focus my analyses and writing on just kind of spreading the knowledge of how to use media as tools for self-improvement, self-knowledge, and equip everyone with the perspectives that I've learned through a lot of reading, a lot of research. I read lots of scholarly articles every day, all day, how to equip everyone with the perspectives and theories for how to make them the most of their time with their favorite games, movies, and online media, and how to incorporate those ideas that they need from those things into their own everyday lives, so that it's not just mindless entertainment. It's something you can approach mindfully and apply the perspectives of to make your life a little bit easier.
I love it. I am a college instructor, but I have no education in education. And a conversation like this really underscores the difference between us. I wish I could think as profoundly and as insightfully as you do. But in lieu of that, I can just appreciate that you're willing to share your profound thoughts and insights on your blog, your channel, and on this podcast. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, Courtney. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. This has been absolutely wonderful. I love talking about this stuff. I could talk all day, but thank you for giving me an hour of your time to let me talk off your ear about everything.
Anytime. There will be links to your YouTube channel, your Twitter, and your blog, all our screen therapy, on my blog at polygamer.net. And I look forward to chatting with you further.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ken.
This has been Polygamer, a Gamebits production. Find more episodes, read our blog, or send feedback at polygamer.net.
I guess I do have a recommendation on a book. It's kind of my Bible. And so if I have anything to pass on to you, as in where all my ideas kind of were born from, and, I've taken them and applied them elsewhere, but still, just in case you're interested, it's the Routledge Handbook of Media Use and Well-Being. It has absolutely everything. I love it. I'm always referencing it. I can send you just a link to the Google Books preview. But I think if there's any, it is difficult to get into scholarly articles. But it's written in a much more kind of accessible way. So if you're ever interested, I just, that's my one recommendation when people ask for research. What do they look for?
I just added it to my Goodreads to read list.
Awesome.